I know, but now they can be all like, woot, woot. I am also afraid and nervous, and luckily in this venue we are all about the mediocre, which means that we embrace the imperfect best that we all have in us, and that is really the embodiment of mediocrity and what today I decided to dub the mediocrity movement, which is the counter movement to the idea that women have to be super women and do it all. We can do it all, it's just all gonna be a little crappy. Some of it'll be good, most of it'll be meh. Thank you all so much for coming out and spending this evening with us. My youngest son has decided that this is the week, well, every week of his 2 years almost, and that he was not gonna sleep. So hopefully I will do a good job for you all, and I won't ramble too much. Brendan, you wanna pull up that first slide for me, love? We got it. We are all broken by something. We have all hurt someone and have been hurt. We have a choice. We can embrace our humanness, which means embracing our broken natures and the compassion that remains our best hope for healing. Or we can deny our brokenness, forswear compassion, and as a result, deny our own humanity. This was written by a man named Brian Stevenson in his book, Just Mercy, which is a story about battling the death penalty, actually here in Georgia, and is a phenomenal read. If you looked at me in 4th grade, besides thinking that I might have just stepped off the set of Stranger Things, or groaning in envy of my bolero tie, you would likely think that I pretty much looked like every other suburban kid. And quite frankly, you would be right. My early childhood was spent in a New Jersey neighborhood lined with starter homes. There were kids in almost every house. You could always find someone to play with if you just were willing to knock on enough doors. There were sleepovers nearly every weekend, and we played flashlight tag late into the night on summer evenings. It was really so much of an idyllic upbringing. My parents were not only still married, but next year they will celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. My brother, who is 2.5 years older than me, would go on to graduate valedictorian of his class and go to the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown and graduate summa cum laude, be accepted into Harvard Law School, which he deferred in order to study in Rome to pursue the Catholic priesthood. And he's now married and has a family of his own and makes a 6-digit figure. From the outside, our life looked pretty close to perfect, despite the stripes. One Christmas Eve, as a young girl, maybe like 6 or 7, I danced by electric Christmas candlelight. This is how this is a Christmas talk. And I had on my favorite dress-up dress. And it like twirled just perfectly when I would dance around. And as a 6-year-old, I loved that. And I had the Nutcracker on the record player because that was like before records were like retro cool. And I was dancing around and it felt so magical and everything just felt so incredible in my little life, and I was just so filled with joy dancing around. And in my exuberance, I did a cartwheel and I immediately fractured my foot. And I was just like, oh no. I hobbled crying to my parents, and I was just like, it's Christmas Eve, oh my gosh, I'm like, oh, how can this happen? And then boy, oh boy, did I get yelled at. Don't I know it's Christmas? Why would I do that? How many times had I been told not to do gymnastics in the playroom? I should stop crying or I would be given something to cry about. Feelings of disempowerment were just absolutely not okay in my family. We were only allowed a very limited set of emotions on the full spectrum of emotions. It was like you could be happy, but you couldn't be raucous. You could be sad, but you couldn't be despondent. You could be a little afraid, but you couldn't be terrified. That those big feelings my parents made the adults in my life feel very unanchored and made them feel very disempowered, and they were very, very uncomfortable with them. And so if you were sick or you were hurt, then the first reaction would be for you to be yelled at. As a kid, you don't have the presence of mind to think, wow, that's crap. And you just are like, okay, well, I didn't know, and I guess I'll just get really good at not telling you stuff. My brother and I walked on eggshells. We never really had a full understanding of emotional boundaries in our house. Everything was okay until it wasn't okay. There would be, you would be allowed to watch TV until you were tired, until you weren't allowed to watch TV anymore, and it was time for you to go to bed right now. And so when you don't have a clear understanding of boundaries, particularly as a child, it's very difficult to have a firm sense of where you begin and where you end, and where others begin and others end. And what that sets you up for as you get older is to really struggle, even more so than just average teenagers and young people, but it sets you up to really struggle with identity and knowing who you are and sort of where you belong. Punishments would be handed out in our family, and then they would be rescinded. That it would just be too inconvenient, or they'd be handed out emotionally, and then it would be like, oh, well, today we won't actually, you won't still be grounded today. Today, we have stuff to do, and I need to go to the store, so, you can watch TV or whatever. And so, it was very difficult to really, have any sense of, a firmness, of surety as a kid. You never knew when things were suddenly just going to change or not be okay. In order to deal with this, my brother threw himself into academics, and I threw myself into athletics. I played everything. I played softball, I played soccer, I ran track, I played volleyball. I'm 5'2", y'all. I played volleyball. I played volleyball, I dove, I swam. By the time I quit gymnastics, I had been going 20 hours a week as an 11-year-old kid. I essentially had a part-time job training for gymnastics. It was okay with me because it gave me a sense of mastery at something, and I couldn't really have a sense of mastery at home. I didn't understand the landscape, and it was upheaval, and I didn't have any sense of feeling sure about anything. But sports allowed me to have that sense of mastery, and it gave me some purpose and ideas of belonging to something greater than myself, and it gave me drive. I now know that my parents did everything that they knew to do to raise me, that they loved me as much as they could. It just wasn't remotely what I needed. They were coming up as parents during the 1980s, and there was this very quiet social revolution that happened in the midst of their parenthood. And so they are not super to blame for struggling through that. When they got married in the 1960s, it was still pretty accepted that the pinnacle of womanhood was to be a stay-at-home mom and to be a housewife. And then somewhere in the middle of all of that, from the time that they got married to the time that I was a young girl, it became expected for women to now at least have a part-time job if their life was going to truly have meaning and truly be fulfilling. And for men, it was during this time that it was now expected that men didn't just provide financially for their families, but that they were also present emotionally and physically and provided, tangible emotional support to their wives and children. And my parents, like many of the parents of my generation, they did not come equipped with those skills and tools at all. And so a lot of the people coming up in my generation really struggle with a lot of mental wellness issues and stuff because our parents literally had no clue how to meet the challenges that were handed to them through no fault of their own. It took me a long time to be able to get to that point and say, hey, you just didn't have the skills and the tools that you had. As a parent, I have chosen to try to get all of the skills and tools that I can possibly gather, some of which are useful, some are not. But because I know more, now I can do more. But there was no internet. There was Dr. Spock and your mom and your grandma. And that was kind of the only information that you had. A few weeks into my 6th grade year, everything in my life was fantastic. I was finally in middle school. I had wanted to be a teenager as long as I could remember. I would get off the bus in kindergarten. It was when there was still half-day kindergarten. And I would tell everybody that I was going to kiddie college. It's totally made up, and I just completely but I was like, I'm going to kiddie college. And I wanted to be teenagers and be around teenagers and dress like teenagers and teenagers. So I was finally almost a teenager, at least going to the same school as teenagers went to. The 8th graders were 13. And I thought that was so awesome. We changed classes, and so my future wasn't so dependent on one single teacher that I had to fight with over and over again about why I thought homework was stupid if I could get A's on their tests. Now, at least I had several teachers that I could make different points with, possibly, and make some headway with about why I thought homework was stupid if I could get A's on their tests. And then my dad came home and told us that we were going to move. He had been offered a job in Michigan. I was devastated. I had grown up just outside of Philadelphia my whole life. My dad's family lived in Philadelphia. And I was so culturally identified with where I lived. The sports teams and the lingo and the music and everything about where I lived was just imbued with part of my fabric of everything that I was. I remember just having no idea really what that meant, but I knew that it was not good. I didn't know how not good it would turn out to be. But the sense of loss just when they told us, and I was like, why didn't you ask us if we wanted to go? But we just, we didn't have that kind of a family, the core values of my family were, economic stability, and providing a solid education for my brother and I so that we could have greater opportunity in the future, which is how many of you probably grew up, where your parents were like, if you do well at school and you get your education, you will succeed in life. We now know that's completely ridiculous and is not representative of current reality whatsoever. But at the time, that was their reality. And that was, my parents threw everything into that paradigm of thought. And my brother clearly excelled at that. He reached all of the marks. And I, as I've mentioned before, thought that a lot of the goings-on of traditional school were ridiculous. I was like, this is just bullshit. Like, it's all just a game that I don't really want to play. We moved, and it turned out we didn't just move to Michigan. We moved to rural southern Michigan, to a town called Temperance. It is, in fact, the only town in the whole country called Temperance. I know this from an episode of Jeopardy. And we moved from a neighborhood where there were kids at least every other house. And the sidewalks went on for miles. You could ride your bikes everywhere. To a neighborhood that had no children. To a school system where 6th grade was not in middle school, but was part of elementary school because they had junior highs, which were 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. That in and of itself was enough to just throw me into just absolute dejection. As someone who had aspired like her whole life hitherto to being like a teenager or teenager-esque, that my 11-year-old self just found that to be just this crushing blow. On top of that, I had to enter into a school where these kids had known each other their whole lives. They had strong bonds and friendships, and they had traditions from which I had no part of. I felt very much like an outsider, so much so that they asked me if I was from England because of the way that I spoke, because I got on the ferry and I drank a bunch of water. And still to this day, my kids just want to kill me because we say things like crayons and museums, and it all rhymes with Shazam. But these Michiganders were like, where are you from? I didn't dress like them. I loved breakdance music. And they were like, what is this? We don't even know what kind of music this is that you listen to. I tried my best to learn how to fit in. And one of the vehicles through which I was still able to make that happen was sports. I didn't have real strong relationships with my family, but I still had sports, and that still gave me a sense of belonging to something greater and the ability to make some friendships with people where we had like common interests and common struggles together and common bonds. When I was about to enter into high school, I had to make a decision. There was the local rural Michigan high school where the team mascot was the Kicking Mules, and their big fundraiser every year was the Mule Drop, in which they brought a live mule into the high school gymnasium that was gridded out, and you would bet on the square that it would poop on. Or go to one of several private schools that were just over the border in Toledo, Ohio, all of which pulled from wealthy families throughout northern Ohio and had a much better record of sending people to better colleges. Despite my aversion to most things having to do with school, I always loved learning. And so I decided, okay, I'll take the entrance exam for these schools, which I got a 99 on, hence my whole, I'm just like, all this does is reinforce my hatred of homework because I didn't study and I still passed their test. And I was like, okay, I'll go to this all-girls Catholic school next year and it'll be fine. In between my 8th grade year and entering into that all-girls Catholic high school, I went for 3 weeks to Northwestern University it was a program for gifted children. I had taken my SATs and I scored high enough that I was able to participate in this program. And I was like, okay, well, how about if I'll go to a class about political science. I was 13 at the time, and my political consciousness was starting to awaken. My brother was 2 years older than me, and so he was actually in high school and was all about like young republicanism, and I was all about the Beatles and 1960s hippie culture, and we already began to clash at the dinner table about our politics. And I was like, all right, well, this is a chance for me to go like learn some more stuff and, you know, gain a sense of being like having a legitimate argument to like my hero and my big brother, and gaining like a sense of having a voice that had some authority at the dinner table rather than just being the little sister. So that was my intention when I went there. But what I discovered while I was there was skateboarders. And I thought they were awesome. I had already been drawn to counterculture movements in the form of like 60s culture. I had begun to find a sense of like identity with the subcultures because I did not feel like I fit in as part of mainstream culture. I never really felt that way, even as a young child before we had moved to Michigan. I always kind of felt like the black sheep in my own family and always kind of did just my own thing. I assimilated a little bit better in New Jersey, but in Michigan, like I really never felt like I assimilated, so I was very drawn to at first 60s counterculture. Then when I discovered skateboard culture, I was hooked. I saw immediately the power that appearance could have. I saw that chosen styles of hair and dress and behavior all could help you discern people's intentions towards you. And it could have shock value. And it had power. As a young woman who felt essentially really powerless in a lot of areas of her life, I loved that. I left Northwestern University and went to go stay with my grandparents who lived close by in Illinois. My grandma went out to go get groceries, and when she came back, I had sheared off half of my hair with her kitchen shears. She was like, oh my God. I went home, and my mom flipped out. I was like, but you're starting this all-girls Catholic school. Like, what? You can't have hair like that. I was like, well, I do. So we'll just have to figure it out. And so she took me to the hairdressers, and they used clippers and made it look a little better than, you know, blunt kitchen shears. But for me, it was an extraordinarily pivotal moment in my life when I saw the power that simply cutting my hair could have. In the sense of knowing that I could cause a reaction just by my appearance. I would go to high school, and I would do okay. Again, I ended up, something that I didn't know is that I would put myself in a situation, again, where most of these people had come from private schools where they had attended together, and had cliques already formed when they entered into high school, and I had no part of that. I didn't even live in Ohio. The other side effect of going to school in Ohio was that there was a law that you couldn't play sports if you lived out of state. Sports had been the thing that was keeping me okay pretty much my whole life. Because there was like football recruiting and stuff like that happened in Kentucky and over the border, mostly in like southern Ohio, they decided that if you lived out of state, you couldn't play sports, that it wasn't fair. I tried some other stuff, the debate team and mock UN and stuff, but it just doesn't have the like same sense of camaraderie when you're like, oh, the security council really kicked ass today. Like, it's not the same as like, dude, we won the championships, yeah! It's like super not the same. And I really floundered and struggled. Part of how that was expressed was to get deeper and deeper into like the punk movement. That how I entered in was through the skateboard culture, and then started going to punk shows, and because of my hair, I was accepted and seen as like, as okay. Like I was legit because I had cool like scene kid hair. And so I would go to shows and I felt like, hey, like they're all like kind of misfits like me. Like I guess maybe I can find some sense of belonging here. Maybe I can like work this and manage this. Maybe I'll make it through okay. My parents, of course, hated the whole thing. And they hated everything about it. I didn't look normal. I didn't act normal. I certainly didn't look like everybody else. And they were completely embarrassed of me. I still, struggled in the same way that teenagers just kind of continue to struggle so often, just, struggling with like who I was and what my purpose was and stuff like that. And I even thought about maybe leaving that environment and going back to public school, but I was like, no, this is okay. My sophomore year, we returned, and I was actually elected president of my class. Which, I ended up leaving that. I did end up leaving and going back to public school at the semester break. But I left as president. What happened in between my freshman and sophomore years was 2 weeks shy of my 15th birthday. I went to a party. It was out in the middle of nowhere in the sticks of Michigan at a horse farm. I drank a bunch of vodka. I totally lied about where I was going to be. And then I was raped by 2 men. I remember saying no, and I remember talking about how I wanted to be an English professor when I grew up. And I remember talking about how I didn't really want to have sex until I was married. I don't remember their names or much else of that night, but I have very specific memories of like what I was wearing and the underwear I had on and what I ate for breakfast the next morning. I didn't know at the time that that was going to be the pivotal pothole that would send my life off on a trajectory. But it set things in motion that I didn't know were about to happen. And the first thing was that I knew without a doubt that I could not tell my parents. There was a self-preservation part of me that knew that if I told them that they would then blame me for my own sexual assault. I couldn't put it in those words, and I did not have like the presence of mind or emotional resilience to know that at the time. But I knew that I could not tell them that they would blame me because I lied and because I had been drinking. And I knew that that would be devastating for me. So I do what so many of us do, and I just shove that trauma right down. For a while, I was okay, because soon after that, I started dating my first real boyfriend. And so that was okay, but here I was with all this unprocessed trauma, and his family was going through a divorce. And of course, we're both 15 and 16 years old, and I mean, you can imagine what cataclysm that relationship would be. When we broke up, that was when I just was consumed. I was I'm so angry. I feel so much rage. All I want to do is just fight people. I don't want to go to stupid Catholic school anymore. I hate everybody. I hate myself. And I didn't understand any of what was going on. I didn't have any other adults in my life that I could talk to. There was nobody saying, hey, what happened? My parents forced me to go to counseling. We would go to family counseling. But they were looking for a family counselor that was going to blame me. And so when we would go to counselors and they would say, hey, this is maybe a family dynamic issue and we all need to talk about it, my parents were we'd leave there and they'd be wow, they were really dumb. We don't want to go, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Because they just wanted me to be the problem in our family because I had my shaved head and my combat boots at this point. I was so just filled with this rage and anger. And at the same time, I'm finding an outlet for it and an expression for that in the punk scene. On the periphery of the punk scene were the skinheads, and they were the angriest people that I knew. I was like, they are my people. I recognized the that like is drawn to like, and I recognized their anger, and I wanted part of that. Entering the skinhead, the white power neo-Nazi skinhead movement was not something that, like, I didn't go sign a piece of paper and say, now I say see Kyle. It wasn't like that. I slid in sideways, and I hung out with the skinheads and fought with them and fought alongside them, and we would get into fights with other people in the punk rock scene and stuff like that. And then I realized that, hey, the price of admission for this is to espouse this racist rhetoric. Okay, all I have to do to be able to belong and have something that felt like family and this like strong bond where we would always have each other's back was to say, I hate brown people, I hate black people, I hate Jews, I hate anyone who doesn't look like me. I hated everything and everyone. It was almost a relief to me to take that big hate and make it smaller. To take this thing I didn't understand that was ineffable and give it a name and a face, at least. At least then it was something that was focused and manageable instead of just this gargantuan monster that I didn't know how to deal with. Slowly over time, I would go out with several different guys that were involved in the white power movement. And what we would call it now would be the creation of an echo chamber. That term didn't really exist in usage the way that it does now. But for me, instead of being like an online echo chamber, it was a physical echo chamber. I only hung out with other skinheads and other white power people. My parents moved to Augusta, Georgia, and I went with them, but then I left, and I went back up to Ohio and lived with some skinheads there. Then when I got sick of that and broke up with that boy, I moved back down to Georgia, and I ended up moving in with a bunch of skinheads that lived in Marietta. And what would always happen is that all of the skinheads and all the white power people would always all live together. And again, it would act as like an echo chamber. So if you maybe had a challenging experience at the grocery store, and maybe you dropped something, and a black man came and helped you pick it up, you could go home to this house full of skinheads, and you could completely dismiss that encounter. And you had people there ready to hear you and help you dismiss that. Because the way that hate works, because we are human beings and we are social creatures, in order to maintain a life of hatred, it has to continue to amplify. So you might start out like singing racist lyrics. A lot of us, especially those of us that are white, we've grown up in just an imbued culture of white supremacy without even knowing it. And so we probably do a lot of things that are actually racist without really knowing it. It's how you sort of enter in. You start singing along with songs, or somebody cuts you off in traffic, and you feel free to like throw a racial epithet out there. And then maybe after you start singing songs, maybe then you just kind of start using racial epithets, just kind of in your daily speech. And then maybe you're like, hey, why don't we like go hang flyers up around? And then it turns to, like, let's go graffiti this building. And by the time I would leave, by the time just before I left the white power movement, I was running guns and throwing tear gas into gay nightclubs. And so this escalation was how you were able to continue to maintain that you would have to perpetually, you would get a tattoo, then you would get a more visible tattoo, and you end up getting a tattoo like on your face or whatever. And that is to sort of like triple dog dare yourself to keep staying in. Because if you don't keep upping the stakes, then you'll just walk away. I ended up moving to Houston, Texas, with one of the skinhead guys that I was going out with. He was in the Army. And my parents had finally just been like, because I would leave and come back and leave and come back. And they were finally just like, you're finally of age and you cannot come back to this house anymore. I was like, okay, whatever. But I didn't have anywhere to live. And his mom graciously took me in. And so I left from Georgia, where he was stationed in the Army, and took the bus down to Texas and moved in with his mom and his little brothers. She took me in knowing that I was a white power skinhead. She took me in with my shaved head. And at the time, that was a little bit earlier. Later, I had a Chelsea, which is a more traditional skinhead haircut. She took me in with my boots and white laces and took me in with my rough demeanor, let me into her home and to live with her other sons, who were twins, who were 11 years old, and a younger son who was 9. She didn't challenge my ideology. She just set some boundaries. And she said, you can stay on the couch here, but you have to help around the house. You have to look for a job. And, just be around, maybe help me with babysitting or whatever if I have stuff that I need to do. I was like, okay, that sounds okay. One of the things that happened with this is that now the echo chamber is broken. I am now not living immersed in a neo-Nazi white power culture. I knew all of the white power skinheads in Houston, but I didn't have regular contact with them. I didn't have a car, and I began to grow increasingly uncomfortable having them come pick me up at the house where I was living with these little boys and their mom who took me in. She expressed to me that, because I was like, why, later I was able to ask her, like, why did you take me in? Like, that wasn't that risky? And she was like, well, when her oldest son, who I was going out with, was a little bit younger, he had really struggled as a teenager, and one of his friends' moms took him in. And it helped him kind of get through some of the hardest parts of his life. And so she was like, I just felt like, now again, we would call that pay it forward. She's like, I just felt like if I ever had the opportunity to do that for someone, that I would do that. And that's something that for me as an adult in my life, that I try to do with all of the people who interact with my kids and my husband and I, and try to make our home a place where people that need to feel unconditionally loved and accepted, that they can come and they can get loved and, and just have a place where they feel safe and okay for a minute. One of the other things that this woman did besides take me in, and just kind of accept me as I was, where I was, is that she began to dream dreams for me that I didn't know how to dream for myself anymore. In the midst of a hate group, you lose the sense of having any personal value. You have value in terms of the movement, my life could be of use as a martyr or, as a vessel to bring forth the new white nation. Of course, little did I know that I would actually do that. I have 7 kids. But I didn't know that was going to happen. At the time, that was part of something that I felt like I could have value doing in the movement. And, as part of this greater thing, that I had value in relationship to that, but I didn't have any personal value, because remember, I'm still struggling through the unprocessed trauma. I feel worthless. I feel valueless. I feel like I don't even have an identity. Now, as someone who works with people who either have exited or who are still inside extremist groups and hate groups of all kinds, I know that it all centers around the ideas of community, identity, purpose, and value. It has almost nothing to do with ideology. The ideology is the thing that binds the group together. That's contrary to what a lot of people probably think, but is true nonetheless. And so much of where people end up is what is culturally available to them. Because I was in the Midwest, which is the only place that I have ever lived before I was in the movement, that someone actually burned a cross on a black family's lawn, that what was available to me that met those needs and at the same time fed my absolute self-loathing and hatred and desire for violence and anger was the white power movement. It could have been anything. It could have been a gang. It could have been, if I had grown up in a Muslim-dominated country, it probably would have been like a jihadist. It could have been, any sort of extreme lifestyle, but this is what got me first. And it had nothing to do with the ideology and had everything to do with the sense I could go anywhere in the country, and because I looked a certain way and said special words, that I would be taken in and treated like family. I needed a substitute in order to get out, because you can't replace any sort of vice in your life with nothing. Anyone who has ever tried to quit any bad habit knows that you gotta fill something in its place, or you won't succeed. You might succeed in a short term, but if you don't learn new skills and you don't put something in that void, you won't succeed at a long-term life change. Anyway, I now have been a non-smoker, well, a smoker who doesn't smoke for 2 years, again, and still every day I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed out and I totally want a cigarette. But for me, like, what I have tried to fill in its place are some other, like healthier habits and like learning how to express my emotions in the moment, which has not necessarily been awesome for my spouse and my kids, not in the short term, but in the long term, I think it will be really awesome. But I had to make a conscious choice to be like, okay, I'm not doing this thing that is a negative in my life. I need to fill it with positive things. What I do now as someone who has successfully disengaged from the neo-Nazi white power movement is to try to help posit some positive ideals and things in people's lives so that as they've disengaged, that they will be able to successfully maintain, at least, in the short term, successfully maintain their disengagement, and in the long term will be able to lead a life of immense healing and where they can thrive and they can heal and then, go on to lead extraordinary lives. When I finally left Houston, the mom had helped me go take my SATs and write to, because this was a time there wasn't any internet, you couldn't just find information online. She actually put me in the car and took me to the library, and we found addresses for the college that I really wanted to go to, which was this tiny little liberal arts college called St. John's College. That's a great books program, and everybody studies all of the great books of Western civilization, and that's how you have your education for 4 years. And I had wanted to go there since I was 13 years old, but I let that go. I didn't, I was like, I'm not even gonna be alive. So what difference does a dream make? And so I left there, and when I got on the Greyhound bus to go back home to Augusta to my parents, I knew all right, I had already started letting my hair grow out. But I was like, that part of my life is done. When I get off of that bus, I need to just make a clean break. I cannot hang out with anyone that I used to hang out with, even if they weren't racist or a skinhead. I need to just have a completely new life. I still was living at home, and things were still not so great with my parents, so I would drive all the time, and I would just drive to go on these long drives. I was so lonely. And there was a night where I showed up at this church, and I sat there. The story's not going to go where you think it's going. And behind the church, there was a volleyball net. You remember that. I played volleyball. But I was like, oh, I'm going to go sit in the sand. I'm going to like dig my toes in and just feel the sand and just look at the stars. And my oldest friend is the moon. And I always like really felt comfort, like just spending time outside. And like that was like an anchor for me. I was sitting there, and then some people drove up. They were like, what are you doing? I was like, I'm just sitting here. Now, my hair was growing out. It was all shaved on top, and it was like long on the sides. It was growing out, and it looked like this like deformed like chicken hair. And because I had been in this counterculture movement since the time I was about from the time I was about 15 and a half up through now, which I was about 19 years old at the time, I sucked at dressing. Like, I didn't know, like, how to dress right. Like, I was all like, I don't know how to put outfits together. Like, I was like, they were probably like, what is wrong with this person that's sitting here in the dark, in the sand alone? And I was like, they were like, oh, well, we're gonna play volleyball. And I was like, can I play? And they were like, yeah. And then I played, and they were like, oh, wow, you're really good. I was like, yes. And they were like, can you play all the time? I was like, yes, I can totally play all the time. And so I don't remember any of their names. I don't remember really, much of the details of that period of my life. But it was the thing that got me through that transition period so that I could embrace, a life on the other side of this life of hate that I had been living, and sort of bridge the gap for me. I would end up going to St. John's College for a year in Santa Fe, and it was so amazing. It's one of my only regrets that I have in my whole life of all the things that I have done is that I didn't finish there. But while I was there, after my first year, I got pregnant, and my dad said, "Well, if you have the baby, I'm not going to pay for your school. If you have an abortion, I'll pay for college." And any ideology aside, I thought that was shit. And I was like, I don't want to play that game. And so you can just, it's your money and you can do whatever you want to do with it, but I don't want your money anymore. And I ended up giving that baby up for adoption. Which, for someone whose life, at this point, I still hadn't dealt with the trauma. I still couldn't say the words, I was raped. To me, the story I told myself about that night was that I had lost my virginity at a party to two men. I still couldn't say I was raped. I still had totally unprocessed trauma. I was still, hurt so deeply. But I was super, super not in a position to be a mom. And so luckily, there was a family that wanted that little girl so very much, and I was able to give her up for adoption. But then I was kind of lost because I wasn't at school anymore, and I was like, I don't know what my direction is. I ended up marrying that baby's dad just kind of for something to do. Because when you're 20, you get married just for something to do, right? And so we ended up getting married, and for a very brief time. But we were able to move to Annapolis, where the sister campus of the school that I went to was located. And I was like, okay, well, I'll just go back. I ended up getting pregnant again with my oldest son. I was 23 years old, and I was just like, I cannot give another baby up for adoption. I just can't. That broke me so much. And his dad was like, okay, well, we can try. I was like, okay, well, we'll try. He and I ended up being married for 15 years, and we had 6 children together. And he's one of the greatest human beings, the most truly kind humans that I have ever met. And we were really good co-parents. We were really lousy at being married, like really lousy. So much so that when we finally got divorced, the kids were just like, well, yeah, of course. Like, it's fine. Like, it's no big deal. Like, it's you guys are living, even though you live in separate houses, our life is exactly the same as it was. They are the best part of me, and they have been the impetus for my commitment to healing and striving towards wholeness and wellness with every ounce of my being and every moment of my day. The little one in that picture is my current husband and I's son. I'd had surgery to not have any more babies because I was like, oh my gosh, nobody should have this many babies. This is ridiculous. I'm so tired. I have to be done. It's time for me to have my own life. I'm going to have surgery to not have any more babies. And I did. And he's 2. Surprise. But they are always a reminder that security is just a superstition and that there's no sort of for sure thing, and you have to lean into the discomfort, and that when you lean into the discomfort and the hard things, that there are glorious things on the other side. My oldest son was born, and I had not ever even changed a diaper. Boy, how have times changed. I had no idea what I was doing. The only thing I knew was that I did not want to raise my kids the way that I was raised. Nobody told me that the hardest part of becoming a parent was going to be dealing with your own upbringing and dealing with like your own huge pile of shit. He was born, and my placenta was retained. I now know that sometimes that happens when you have some fear or ambivalence about being a mom, which I totally did. I was 23, and I had no idea what I was doing. And but I had him in a hospital with a midwife, and she was like, it's time, and we have to call the doctor because that's what we have to do to keep us out of trouble. I was like, okay, and the doctor came in, it's the middle of the night, he's angry because I don't have an IV or anything, and he's like, we gotta manually, and like shoved his hand in my uterus, and I was like, whoa! I was like, can you just hold on a second, please, and like let me regroup now that I know what's gonna happen? And he was just like, no, blah, blah. I was like, whoa, okay. In the days after my oldest son, his name is Tim, his birth, I was just like, what the hell just happened? I was like, this angry man put his body inside my body without my permission, and he was really mad at me. And like, oh, there's a name for that. It's called rape. Oh, and I was raped when I was 15. That's what that was. I didn't lose my virginity. And so here I am, and I'm trying to like learn how to nurse him and like give of myself in a way that I had never given before. And the trauma is just pouring and washing over me as I'm like trying to figure out this whole like motherhood gig, and it was just so immense. It was my first bout with like huge postpartum depression and stuff, which I would later come to like understand and figure out. But it was also cathartic because I was doing it in this context of this immense love that was revolutionary in my life. I was just like, I was so like, what bad is going to happen? Something bad clearly is going to happen to him because this is too good. I love him too much. Like this is love like this shouldn't really exist. But it did. And it fueled me to heal at all costs and to seek wholeness. And 20 years later, I feel like, I still have healing to do, but I feel like we're well on the way, and part of the way that I was able to make good with my own healing and at the same time raising these babies was a commitment and a choice that I made to be totally transparent. I made a commitment to not try to pretend to be okay to my kids. Not to make them responsible for my not okayness, but to say, hey, I've never been a mom of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 kids before, and I'm totally making it up as I go along. I'm not always going to be okay. Sometimes I'm going to be really not okay, and they'll tell you even now if I'm really tired or under a lot of stress that I still will flip out and yell and be awful. But I have learned the art of saying I'm sorry and accepting responsibility for my actions and owning when I have fallen short. And that imperfection that I have embraced radically has ended up yielding to an extraordinary set of human beings finding their own place of vibrancy in their own diverse culture. They just lead these extraordinary lives and are these amazing human beings. And I know everybody says that, but there are enough people here that know my kids that can be dude, yeah, they're pretty, they're really awesome. And I to me, I think they are that way because I was able to get out of the way and support them being them and whatever their definition is and their image is of them at any given moment, and support that rather than trying to impart my view and my vision of what they ought to be. But that required me really embracing brokenness and seeing that as our shared human condition. Brendan, next one. This quote speaks to me so very much, and with everything that's going on in our culture, the struggles that we have going on right now, and how do you deal with Nazis when they come to town? How do you deal with people whose viewpoints we find abhorrent? How do we deal with them? What do we do? I feel like we are at a really pivotal point in our history as human beings, and that we're either going to bond together and make it through, or we're going to have some huge struggles in front of us. This is actually a quote of a quote. This is a quote from the author sharing a quote that a man named Paul Farmer, if you've ever read Mountains Beyond Mountains, is an amazing man. His quote of another person named Thomas Merton, who was a contemplative monk, who was one of my heroes from when I was really a young kid. And it's, "We are bodies of broken bones." I guess I'd always known but never fully considered that being broken is what makes us human. We all have our reasons. Sometimes we are fractured by the choices we make. Sometimes we're shattered by things that we never would have chosen. But our brokenness is also the source of our common humanity, the basis for our shared search for comfort, meaning, and healing. And so my challenge to you is to look at your own life, see your brokenness, and hold it up before you. Borrow my courage to talk about the worst things that I have done and that have been done to me. And when you are confronted with actions or people that you find abhorrent, whether in real life or online, or even just while reading a news story, lean in. Remember that they are broken too. Ask them their story. Really listen to what they have to say. Empathize with the humanity behind their hate-filled words and actions. For our humanness is what will save us, and we can all definitely do with some saving right now. Thank y'all so much for coming. Hopefully it wasn't too rambly. And the mic is open for questions, because almost always people have questions. Don't be shy. I just told you all my worstest stuff. So if you have any questions, a lot of times people are like, well, what do you do? How did you get into doing this?
So I have a question.
Sure.
So you were at a Catholic school?
Yes.
And I know that the KKK didn't like Catholics. Do the skinheads have a thing against Catholics too?
It wasn't as based around religion like that. It was a little more accepting of a broader range of people that, and even within the KKK at this point, like in the modern era, that being Catholic is not a precursor for not belonging. That was something that was, a lot of it had to do with the Catholics being predominantly like Irish and Italian immigrants, and they were seen as sort of less at first, but now, in the, up after maybe like the 1950s, that they were all really sort of accepted into the fold. So it wasn't even really a thing. And there's actually a really famous black actor who was in Oz. I can't even begin to pronounce his name. Who identifies as that he was a self-proclaimed like Nazi skinhead. When I actually entered the movement in Toledo, one of the skinheads who self-identified as Nazi was a big black man named Carlos. And there were lots of, on the periphery, there were, in all the different places I lived, there were actually like Hispanics and stuff like that.
How could they do that? I mean, how did you?
Well, exactly. It's a big hint that there's more than just ideology going on there. If that his explanation for it was like, oh, well, I'm like half Cherokee. And like, whatever, everyone was like, okay, you're this big dude and you'll fight with us. Okay, whatever. Like, well, let's go drink a beer. That it just wasn't a thing, that if you were just around and you were identified, that there was a lot of times that you would be accepted. And very many people that I have talked to over the years, that this was true, that this was not an exception, that throughout the country, it was not the main thing. I mean, mostly it was, angry young white males predominantly. But it happened enough that it's very commonplace amongst those that identify as like former white supremacists.
Wow.
So hopefully that answered your question.
Okay.
My propensity for rambling. And I now actually I have done some volunteer work with Life After Hate in the past, and I work alongside Christian Picciolini, who sometime this month he'll be on 60 Minutes, and he was one of the co-founders of Life After Hate and runs Exit USA and does a lot of exit work for people disengaging from lives of hate. And I have partnered with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and the Gen Next Foundation and the Against Violent Extremism Network, and we just did a training for the police department in Seattle. It's the first of its kind in the country, developing a strategy for intervening and preventing violent extremism in the communities, and so like that's what I do now. And I bartend here, and I run these talks, and I parent my kids, and do a bunch of random stuff. But that's that's I didn't actually like say that that's kind of like what I do now, but that's that I use my experiences and my very sort of unique skill set to try to meet people where they're at and help them know that if they're ready to disengage, that there are programs here, and that then I will help connect them with the resources that they need at any point in their journey of disengagement, and help them create a new sense of community. Like I was saying, where it's when you disengage, you have to fill it with something. And so trying to create, whether online or in a real life setting, community where they feel like they can belong and where they don't feel judged for their past.
And it may be a little different from what it sounded like from your story, but what is the reaction from that community when they find out that members want to leave?
It can vary widely. It's one of the reasons that I feel very compelled to share my story, because I have the support of my family. and I don't feel bodily threatened to share my story. All of my computers and everything are encrypted because there are like cyber attacks on people that have a higher profile in the anti-hate community. So I try to make sure that I rotate my passwords and stuff like that. For some people, they are bodily threatened. Their families are threatened, or there's violence that can often be a very real threat for people. And in those cases, if we are helping them disengage, it's crucial to help them get to a safe place, to get them to safety, and anyone that is their loved one, to get them to like a safe place. As obviously, like, your personal safety is the number one concern, and it can vary. It can vary. Depending on the really like hyper local politics of a particular hate organization, and how much of a physical threat that there is for that person. A lot of people disengage more gradually. A lot of it isn't like, I'm coming in and I'm gonna save you from this hate group, and we're gonna, a lot of it is, hey, I see that you are like having some questions about this. I'm here if you want to talk, and I totally understand where you're coming from. And 6 months later, you get an email like, oh, hey, thanks for that email, or whatever. Just a lot of it is much more gradual, that the sort of brokennesses and empty places, and as their echo chamber gets broken, whatever it is, whether it's a virtual echo chamber or like a physical echo chamber, as that begins to break down, or that they have a meaningful encounter with someone who is the object of their hate, that then they're not amplifying their belief anymore. And so when you're not amplifying, you're de-escalating. And so, like, for some people that happens once they're in prison, and then they have to interact with people of all different races. For some people, when they have babies, they're just like, oh, I feel, the humanity in this little child, and I don't want them to grow up hating and full of anger. For some people, it's, just a chance encounter with someone in their life, a janitor, or something like that, somebody that challenges their idea of dehumanizing the other people. So for a lot of people, it happens more gradually. And when it happens more gradually, then there is less threat of violence towards the individuals. But there is a threat. Bueller.
So I might have missed this because I came in late, but did your familial background play a role in that? Like, did you come from racist parents or uncles, or like, where did that, like you said, it could have been anything, but I'm just wondering if you had a predisposition to that based on your family.
In the picture where we're all in stripes, I don't know if you saw that, the man standing on the right-hand side of that picture is my uncle, who is homosexual. When he came out to my brother and I when we were young adults, we were both just like, duh, like, of course you are. We've known that our whole lives. So that was part of our life. But I grew up outside of Philadelphia, and my perception up until very recently was that my school was pretty multicultural. I went back recently and I looked at pictures and I was like, oh, there's like 3 brown people. Like, this was not as like diverse as I thought in my class. When I was a kid, I was actually like in a breakdance group with Kenyatta, Shante, Dante, and Todd. The idea of judging someone by their race was not part of my thinking. However, it was definitely part of the fabric of society and my family in the way that it is still for so many people. Where if you asked my parents if they were racist, they would be like, no. But if they got cut off in traffic, then N-words would be flying, and if, God forbid, any Puerto Ricans would move into their grandparents' neighborhood, the property values were gonna plummet, and it was okay to make jokes about Jews, and that it was like, as long as it was a joke, it was okay, and as long as you were talking about the value of property, it was okay. But if you confronted them and was just like, dude, that's race, and which are conversations I have with my parents now, and it's like, that's racist. My kids will be like, Grandma, you can't say that, and they're, and so they weren't aware of their racial biases, but they were definitely there. But they were not, in my case, it was not something like, I didn't come from the legacy of like the Klan or anything like that. Like I didn't come from an overtly racist or anti-Semitic background.
I have more questions.
Sure.
Okay, you said it takes the people a while, like, to de-escalate. Have you, in your experience, noticed people, and maybe because of the climate that we're in, or if this is a thing, I don't know, becoming more racist later in life? Like, like they were very liberal or thought a certain way or cried at Obama's inauguration, and all of a sudden they're Trump lovers. Because that's happened to people in my family, and I'm just wondering if you've seen that.
What's going on?
Yeah, what's going on?
The trend, the demographics don't show that as a huge trend. Primarily the uptick has been in young people, and I think with a lot of the older people, because people are like, wow, racism is on the rise, and like I don't believe that that's actually true. I believe that it's just people who feel emboldened to express things that they've always felt because of the climate in which we find ourselves politically, and so where the cultural norm was just like, dude, diversity. Like, this is what we're doing and this is the direction that we're moving in as a culture. You can't say that anymore. That people read the Twitter feed and are just like, oh, well, there's like a white supremacist who's the chief of staff right now. We can maybe say this now. And they do, and they get away with it. And coming from the White House and the White House staff right now, there's lots of code language that that the people who are already inclined to racist beliefs, like, they totally understand. One of the first things that Trump did was on Holocaust Remembrance Day, the press release that he put out mentioned nothing about the Jews, which to most like average everyday Americans are just like, yeah, well, lots of people died, it's not that big of a deal. But it's code, because Holocaust deniers and the whole culture of people who deny the Holocaust, that's one of their big arguing points, that they're just like, well, there was a lot of people died during World War II, not just the Jews. So we won't specifically say the Jews. And so the people that are already inclined towards those beliefs totally know what that's about. It leaves also it leaves Trump with like plausible deniability, so that people can just be like, oh, he just whatever, like he didn't know or whatever. But people like me that are on the other side that are virulently combating hate are like, whoa. And the people that are already inclined to those beliefs are like, yeah. And so they feel emboldened. And so the people that are already kind of like, anti-establishment or whatever, that they feel really empowered. And they feel like, finally, I get to be like this, finally it's okay to be white in America again, or whatever, because we struggle so deeply with meaningful conversations about race. And so I think some of the older generation is that, where it's like they feel empowered to express views that they've always held. And then the younger people coming up, like there's a whole, if you look at the struggle for racial identity and meaning, and you view it through the lens of like they're looking for a sense of community, identity, purpose, and value in their lives, it begins to make a lot more sense. It's always going to be a movement full of young people. Any hate group, any extremist movement is always going to be predominantly made up of, people like the Faces in Charlottesville. I was like, no, that's like, of course that's who. They're 19, 20, and 21-year-olds. Of course that's who it's going to be. They don't have all of their brain yet. They don't really understand the long-term consequences. The one kid who's there who's like, I didn't know that people would like say bad things about me. Like, I'm like, dude, I feel you. I know you didn't. You know why? Because you don't have all of your frontal lobe. Yeah. Like, and you really, really didn't understand the long-term consequences of your actions. It doesn't excuse them, and it doesn't mean that your actions didn't hurt other people. But I get it for you. I get that you didn't understand those consequences. And so for some of them, for some of the young people, they're sort of like trying on an ideology that feels empowered and gives them a sense of community and identity and belonging. Just because there's a lot of factors that are feeding into that. The kids that are coming up out of school now, like they're coming into adulthood with huge amounts of debt, with an education that doesn't serve an economy that we have anymore. There's a lot of like hopelessness that's just part and parcel with like coming of age in America right now, and so I understand that that the uptick with that is happening, and then just that the sense of empowerment to express what's always been there. Hopefully that answered your question. It was a really long-winded answer.
Have you been able to like reconnect with anyone that you were like connected with when you were a part of that has also left that movement?
Yes. I mean, the picture where we were both like Sieg Heiling, that's actually Christian Picciolini. And he and I had known each other. I had been going out with a friend and neighbor of his, and I went up. His mom like was so Italian, she didn't even like speak English, and I showed up there Thanksgiving night, and she was just like, no. and she was like, she wouldn't even feed me. I was not allowed in her house. And so I ended up like living with Christian at his house, since my boyfriend's mom wouldn't let me even in her house. And so he and I ended up reconnecting. He was actually fundraising for a book that he wrote, Romantic Violence, which his new book coming out is a reworking of. And he had managed a band that I love, Flatfoot 56, and they put it on their page, and I was like, Christian Picciolini? Are you kidding me? Like, I was like, is this you? He's like, dude, yeah. And so we reconnected. And then there have been a couple other people that I've reconnected with. I was in New York City doing a talk at Friends Seminary in Manhattan, and one of the teachers that was there actually grew up and was like in the punk scene in Toledo, and she was just like, oh, did you know Carlos? I was like, yeah, I know Carlos. And she was like, who were you going? I was like, yeah, I was going out with Joe. And she was like, yeah, oh, and his sister. And so that was really like, I was like, wow, that's really weird. And she's like, that's amazing. Like, and there have been a handful of other people just sort of like on the periphery from that time that we've reconnected. And people kind of come out of the woodwork too, like when things like Charlottesville happen, that there's and as more incidents happen in our culture, that the people that maybe have stayed silent, that have a past similar to mine, that they feel a responsibility to come forward and do what they can to help, since we inflicted this hurt and this pain on other people, that part of healing is trying to make amends. And so people have there have been a handful. I wish there were more, and that the stories all had happy endings. Some of them do not have happy endings. A lot of them have jail and death as the end, and it's not a good ending.
I was wondering, what do you do, or like helped with the guilt, and like I could just imagine feeling just like paralyzed by the enormity of one's past, and like how to deal with how you dealt with that.
That is a fantastic question because a lot of my colleagues, I suspect, are very guilt-driven. That they kind of are like, I will never be cleansed from this. I have to work harder than the hardest human to like make this better. And not that that's not a worthy endeavor, but I don't know that it's necessarily. They're never going to exercise this as part of their past. The answer for me is maybe a little complicated. For part of my time as a young mom, I was very devoutly Catholic, and a lot of my moral life, even though I don't self-identify as Catholic at this point, a lot of my moral life was really informed by that. And one of the things that I have had to wrestle with my whole life, and especially post, white supremacist skinhead life, is a sense of feeling unlovable and unworthy of love. It was within the Catholic moral life where I started to have to come to terms with the fact that that maybe I'm inherently lovable, and it doesn't matter what I do. Then that doesn't really affect whether I am or am not lovable. But I wasn't convinced. It took me a very, very long time. Actually, the way that I think I finally was able to be free, and why I feel like I able to be effective at what I do, because I have a sense of where I end and where other people begin, actually happened in the storage room here in this building. And my oldest son was here helping me, and I was closing up after a shift. He was 18, so it was just a couple years ago. And he was just helping me line trash cans. I was like, oh, thanks, man. And I was like, oh, I hope that when you all grow up, that that if you don't have kids, which is totally an okay choice. I totally get why people might make that choice. If you're, on the road and you're touring, or if you're doing good stuff, or if you just, if that's just not your jam or whatever. I hope it's for positive reasons. I hope it's not because growing up in this mayhem has crushed your spirit and you're just forget it. I never want to have kids ever. And he stopped and he looked at me. I was like, Mom, don't you get it? I was like, yeah, what? He's like, when your grandkids and your great-grandkids are just wildly happy and living these lives of just meaning and purpose, it'll be because of you. Because you decided that you would break the chain and that you would do different things. And since that moment, because this is the kid that basically I grew up with, and he has seen me at my worst and has seen me wrestle through the most difficult things that I've ever had to wrestle through and figure out from 23, who I was and how to parent, and he has witnessed, some of my biggest tantrums and meltdowns and the awfulness that can exist inside parenthood. And he loves me unconditionally for me, real me, not Heidi me that only shows the best parts. And from that moment, I was I am unconditionally loved for exactly who I am. And that has been deeply empowering for me to be able to offer myself and my life and the things that I'm really good at to other people without being sort of subsumed by them, and without being I've got to fix you. Just being this is what I can offer you, and it's up to you to make use of that. And if you want to make use of that, I'm totally here for you, and I will hold your hand if that's what you need or whatever. But that moment was super transformative for me to sort of excise that guilt for me, that I'm I have made good on my life. And, you know, and part of that also is just a personal commitment I have to living every single day, all the way, for good or for bad, whether it's awesome, amazing things or terrible, awful things, whether it's yelling at my baby in the middle of the night, like, stop touching my hair, because that's real and it's all the way. Or if it's like, oh my gosh, you just like got into this program, you got a scholarship, that's amazing, or whatever it is, like feeling all of the feels all the way every day. And, you know, and that also, like, I think has been a crucial part of, you know, for me, that making good on my life. And, you know, and so from here out, like, for me, it's all kind of gravy. Like, you know, I will continue to do what I do because I feel like, you know, like this is what I've been given to do in this life, and that I'm uniquely suited to do it. But I'm not driven by guilt. Thank you. Come on.